Hi.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. This is you roll with this
We
stuff.
actually are live now. Can someone tell us if they can see it? This is so. Yeah, I think we are. So I'll just start again. What are we doing?
Yes.
We're doing profit. Hello and welcome to the Social Recruiting Show. We are here with Katrina Kibben from 3 Years Media and Lars Schmidt from HROS as long as Amplify Talent. And we were talking about the HROS survey. Could you give a little bit of a brief overview of that again?
Yeah, so we launched a survey 2 weeks ago because we really wanted to benchmark this idea of the future of work. I think it's a term and a concept that we read about all the time, hear about all the time, talk about all the time. But a lot of times that's conversation is being led by analysts and pundits and people that aren't actually in the seat doing the work. And so we really wanted to kind of benchmark views of practitioners in HR and recruiting all around the world on like, what are their priorities now? What are they focused on today? And what do they think that will look like for them 3 years from now? So kind of 3 years is our future of work horizon. And so we're going to be gathering all the data. The survey runs until next Friday, April 6th. At that point, we're going to take with our HROS survey analyst in residence, George LaRock, we're going to analyze all the data. We're going to create a report based on our kind of findings from the data. But then what we're also going to do is create a digital visualization microsite with all the data so that anybody can come and they can toggle the different fields to like understand perspectives in North America, for example, versus EMEA, or HR versus recruiting, or kind of director and above versus individual contributors. So a lot of the variables that we have, we're going to build a site that will allow users to come and kind of on demand adjust those to tell the stories and get the learnings they want to get out of the data.
You can use that for executive buy-in, I imagine, right?
Executive buy-in, like we kind of see this as being, our aim is to build something that's kind of going to be usable throughout the year. So for practitioners to take from an executive buy-in perspective, certainly the HR tech, this is going to be a gold mine of data for the HR tech community because it's going to be all kind of, practitioner perspectives on tools they're using now, tools that they expect to be buying in the next year, tools they expect to never use. And then for speakers and writers as well, like it's going to be we see this being kind of reference material for them to be able to pull back on for keynotes and talks and also stories and blog pieces and white papers.
There's probably a huge opportunity for leaders to train their teams with this data as well, to kind of like push them towards this 3-year perspective instead of focusing so hard on the things that are in their face right now.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that practitioners face today. I mean, frankly, that was one of the kind of thought threads in creating HR open source is that, the role of a practitioner is hard. Like I come from that world. I think we've all come from that world at some point, and certainly everybody watching, many of you are practitioners. Like the demands of your day job are massive. And you've got, especially if you're in recruiting, you've got 20 recs. Every rec is the most important rec you have in the view of the hiring manager. You've got candidates. You're trying to maintain candidate experience. You've got projects. Your boss is flipping articles of what Google is doing and Facebook is doing and saying, hey, why aren't we doing that? Right. So it's hard. It's a high pressure job. And so the natural inertia of a practitioner job pulls your head down, right, to your desk, and it makes you focus on the now. And that's an understandable kind of trap to fall into. But the reality is so much stuff is happening around us, and the world of the now is changing rapidly. And so if we're not kind of forcing ourselves to look up and look around and figure out what's going on around us and look at new technology, look at new practices, look at generational shifts and how that's impacting the workforce, like all these things that are happening around us, then by the time we pull our head up, it's going to be a different world, and then we're kind of starting over again. So finding tools that can kind of help you keep pace with what's happening and ensuring that you bake that into your day job as a practitioner, I think is vitally important now.
Yeah. I think there are kind of two modes that people end up falling into. It's like pants on fire or perspective, right? Yeah. And when we're hiring for talent leaders, I think so often we really admire the pants on fire people because they have I increased it by 30%. I closed this many recs. I did this. I did that. And people don't value perspective enough. But I think HROS has been the first place that has offered a cumulative effort of perspective pieces not just pants on fire strategy. So
yeah, I think that's right. I think what's interesting about it is, there's this sense of this real sense of community in HROS, because it's practitioners collaborating with practitioners and sharing their failures and where they screwed up and all these things that are so it's a part of being a practitioner. Like, you're going to have missteps, you're going to have issues, you're going to have struggles, but knowing you've got people all around the world that have experienced that or are experiencing that, or are tackling the same things that you are. There's a degree of comfort in numbers of just, knowing that some of those people have solved that thing and they'll tell you how, but other people will maybe just kind of more commiserate with you and be like, yeah, we're dealing with that here as well. So
absolutely.
I have to say, case studies are great, but I also I forget the name of the other page. It's like tools where you could just kind of download things. And I've used the employer brand dashboard, and I've also used, I think Shonda's, was it LinkedIn training? I've used a couple of those, and I love that you get examples, not copy, but get ideas from.
Yeah, it's funny. We there was an interview. SHRM did a story on open source and HR, and they interviewed Celinda Appleby, and so they're asking her about her contributions to HROS, and she had a quote that really kind of was profound to Ambrosia and I, and kind of stuck with us, and actually shaped a bit of how we redesigned the site, which is that she said in a couple of years HROS is going to be the Google for progressive HR and recruiting, and we were like, huh. And it kind of, and I think as you see, it was less of like, hey, or Google, and more of like the utility of it. So Ambrosia and I were kind of thinking like, okay, how do people want to interact with our content, right? Like, and I think the old site structure was a fairly traditional site structure. And then we're like, well, what if we redesigned it like a Google and made it, because if I'm a practitioner, I want to be able to go in, and if I'm trying to solve X problem, I want to go in and say like, what do you have to help me solve X problem? And so that's why we ended up redesigning the site around search, was actually based on that comment. So now you go there and like, yes, you can navigate through and see sponsors and see community stuff. And if that's what you want, that's there for you. But if you just want to get in, get what you need and get out, like, we're optimized for search now. And so that was a big piece. And shout out to Celinda for kind of helping us view it that way.
Totally. Well, and I think that you just touched on something that's really important, and I think has been a like historical challenge for talent, is that there is not a traditional pipeline of education that you take to become a recruiting HR, like fill in the blank, right? It could be trying not to crack up at the fart jokes. But like even the education that HR, traditional HR people are getting doesn't prepare them for the real world experiences that they're having. And I think that's why I personally really respect HROS, is because it gives some framework for you probably could know how to do this. Like, these are the types of functionalities that are helpful. So how do you decide what to create as far as the dashboards and things that Audra was talking about?
Yeah, I think you raised a good point. When we first started creating HR open source and we started going to conferences and speaking, I think people were, because it was a thing that didn't really exist, right? It's this kind of this weird, different thing that is unlike traditional things that are out there. So people are like, okay, are you going to, certify a body of knowledge? Are you going? And we're like, no, like that's not our role. Like, our role is like, we want to find people doing interesting stuff that's kind of more towards the progressive nature of HR and recruiting. And we want to highlight that work, and we want to make that visible and available so that other practitioners can see it, be inspired by it, copy it, right? Or allow that to steer a version of that they do. And so that's kind of the role that we see fitting. And so we'll talk to, our Facebook group is what we call kind of our collective intellect. So that's where a lot of the conversations are happening around like what people are struggling with, what they're working on. And in a lot of ways that will inspire kind of what we go after in terms of case studies and sparks. So like, we know, for example, there's increasing conversation around chatbots, right, in recruiting. So we went after Anchor Trust, and Chris Ray is doing fabulous work there in London, and so he'd contributed a case study. People are talking about design thinking in HR, and we're working on a case study around that right now. So I think really the community helps. Like Ambrosia and I, we're not the ones to say like, oh, this is what you should know, and this is like, that's not our role. Like our role is to create the platform and the vehicle for the community to say, hey, this is what we need. This is what we're struggling with. And then help kind of find examples of that in the community that we can bring to light to inspire other folks.
Which someone wants to submit a case study, they just go on the website, right? hros.io?
HRS.co, and you can contribute a case study. And then also, I think, case studies are fantastic. That's like the source code of what we do from an HR open source analogy. But those are not easy to write. They're in depth, they're detailed, they're written by practitioners. We edit them. So they can take, depending on the cycles of the person writing it and the author, months to develop. So there's that. And then there's also Sparks. And Sparks are kind of lightweight, snackable case studies that should take you no more than 15 minutes to write. So the idea behind Sparks, 15 minutes to write, a minute to read, right? Digestible, small, short. Audra, you contributed one in the pilot group when we first launched the Sparks. But we wanted to create, one of the things that we always do is we're constantly kind of talking to the community to get feedback. Like, how can we make this more valuable to you? And, what we heard from a lot of practitioners is like, look, we want to share, but we don't have the bandwidth to write a case study, or maybe we don't have permission, right, to kind of give that level of detail, which we get. And so that was a driver behind creating Sparks, is we said, let's create a lightweight, snackable thing, super easy to contribute. You can contribute that through the site. We have a survey form. You can actually go to our Facebook page and contribute it through the dumbest bot ever made. This bot will only allow you to do this, so don't trick it. You can trick it easily. It's like yes and no. Just answer the question it asks you. If you try to do anything else, you're gonna break it. So, but you can do it that way. And again, 15 minutes to contribute a Spark, and it's a way for us to highlight work. It was interesting. Last week, actually earlier this week, I was having lunch with a friend who wrote a case study, probably a year and a half ago now, and she was telling me how that case study led to 3 speaking gigs for her. And then in her latest job, when she was interviewing with the CEO pulled out the case study and said that he had read the case study. And that was one of the things that kind of enticed him about her background, because that type of work is the kind of work that he wanted to do in his recruiting team. And that's not the first time I've heard that. So I think that's one of the interesting things about the case studies and the Sparks, is because they're so visible and public, it's a great way for us to shine a light on practitioners that may not have that light. But it's also a great way in terms of your own brand as a practitioner, a great way to have this thing out in the world that showcases your work and what you do. And again, I've talked, that's probably the 5th person I've talked to who has contributed a case study, who has either gotten a speaking gig or a new job based on the visibility of the work.
That's awesome. And the real moral of the story here is, I think, don't be scared to share your story. I'm so glad that you exist as a safe place for people to share their stories, because I think up to a certain point, people felt weird about saying, look at this awesome work I did. They didn't know where to put it. They didn't know how to format it. And you kind of gave them a place for that.
Yeah. And I think that the cool thing about that too is we were very deliberate in weaving in where you failed in the case study, because there wasn't I think that, and we all we're all bloggers. We're kind of in this there's a lot of look at me, and there's a fine line between the read my stuff, and I'm trying to contribute this for a cause, for a greater cause of some sort. And I think having the case study where again, if you're promoting that, you could say, that's look at my stuff, but you're in there hey, here's where we failed. These are the mistakes we made. So there's a degree of humility embedded in the case studies that I think is really important, because it also makes it more relatable.
Right.
So.
Now, is your learning lab, that's not related to HRS, that's Amplify, right? What's that?
Yeah, that's Amplify. So that was something, for probably 5 years now, I've had different versions of newsletters. And so I've always been curating content around kind of things that are interests to me. So, recruiting, employer brand, future of work, D&I, et cetera. And I had been just clipping them into an Evernote folder. And so I had this massive Evernote folder of all these resources, and I would tag them so that, I could go back and reference them when I'm doing client work, or I could share them with a client if they needed to know, why are we doing X? I could give them some supporting resources. Hey, here's a little more context into what we're doing. but it just sat there in a folder. And so I'm like, this is helpful for me, but I have all this stuff. Like, why don't I find a way to like open it up to everybody? And so I came across this new community platform called Mighty Networks. And I was really intrigued by the functionality of it. And so I said, let me just pilot this and kind of take all of my archives, load them up into Mighty Networks, tag them so you can follow topics. And so, yeah, it's not associated with HR open source, but it's basically just my like library of all of my resources. And then I add to it as I encounter new things that are interesting. And so instead of doing a newsletter that's just kind of a push and you don't really know who's engaging with the content or if they are, and for me, I always found click-through rates on the Amplify newsletter were pretty low, to the point where like a couple times I'm like, why am I doing this? Like a handful of people are getting something out of it. And then I'd get feedback from somebody saying like, hey, this is great. We love your newsletter. And I'm like, okay, well, that's cool. But then I look at the numbers again. I'm like, okay, well, like your company is probably the only company looking at this. And then I was like, why don't I create something that's a little more dynamic and searchable? Because of the newsletter, like you may get it and you may be like, ooh, that looks like a really interesting article, but I don't have time to read that now. And then it gets buried in your inbox and it's gone forever. Whereas like now this is a community around the content where you can go and search. And just the other day, like somebody posted on Facebook in one of the groups wanting kind of big publication articles on employer brand. And I was like, oh, I've got those. And so I just went into the library, kind of followed the employer, or looked in the employer brand folder and had a bunch of stuff, and it was able to send them a bunch of links. So
nice.
Yeah,
totally. So speaking of employer brand, I believe that was part of our promise for the day, was to talk EVP with you.
Yeah.
So, all right. So let's start with the age-old argument. Is it an employee value proposition or an employer value proposition?
I have two answers. The first one is employer. The second is I don't care. Like honestly, it's weird. Like some people take it so they're like, it's like religion to them, and I'm like, I don't really give a damn. Like I call it employer when I talk about it. I talk about, because in my mind, I'm like, it's the value prop that the employer is delivering to the employee. But I also don't care. Like, I'm not going to put a stake in the ground and be like, it's employer, and if you don't think it's that, you're wrong. Like, I don't call it employee, it doesn't matter to me. Yeah, I mean, right. But some people are like very, oh, it's this. I'm like, I don't, I'm not that. I call it employer, but I don't have a strong preference.
I don't even want to tell you how many hours I've spent on corporate calls discussing that conversation.
Yeah.
But how do you define it? So what's kind of yours? The Lars definition of what an EVP is, or what it means to people.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think the EVP is is kind of the promise that the company makes to their employees about what they can experience working there. It's rooted in reality. It's largely driven by actual experience, but there's often a degree of aspiration in it as well. So some of the things are things that you as an organization may strive to be. Maybe you're not that yet, but you are kind of committed to going in that direction. But there should be enough reality in it that any employee anywhere in the company can read that and be like, yeah, that's familiar. Like, I get that. If they're reading that and be like, ooh, that company looks awesome, but it's not my company. Like, that's not a good EVP.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So you do this kind of work with clients, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so I probably developed a dozen EVPs in my day.
Yeah. So for the people who, are thinking about doing a project like this or have it on their radar to update theirs, where do you start when you think about doing an EVP?
Yeah, it's funny. I think kind of similar to the employee or employer, I think some people have a very regimented approach to how they feel an EVP needs to be developed, and it has to be heavy surveys and research and data and that. I don't necessarily feel that way. I think that I think you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that, and if you have the bandwidth and the company has the willingness to let you dig in that deeply, that's great. But I think you can also develop an EVP in much lighter weight manners, and I've certainly done that for clients too. And so for me, generally what I'll do is I'll first kind of assess, like, what is your appetite for kind of digging in to really kind of get at the heart of the data. So if you, is this a long project where you're cool doing kind of heavy research and surveys and intakes, because we can do that, or is it more of an accelerated thing? I mean, a lot of companies that I find They do employee engagement surveys, they do pulse surveys, they do lots of things already. And so they're kind of like, we don't want to, like, our employees have survey fatigue. We don't want to dig in, or we did this a couple of years ago and here are the results. So in those cases, what I'll typically do is I'll get my arms around everything they have. So all of their employee engagement survey data, pulse survey data, mission, vision, values, any data they have around turnover and retention. Basically, I'm like an information vacuum where, like, I want everything. And then at this point, I can kind of distill through all of that to identify key themes, key kind of employer brand pillars that I'll use to develop the EVP. So at this point for me, like, I can generally, in the last couple of projects I've had, the companies have wanted to do something a little more lightweight. So I've been able to kind of say, okay, send me all of your stuff. I'll dig through it and I'll create the EVP based on that.
Interesting.
What do you do if the CEO says, this is who we are, and then you dig through the surveys and it's not?
I tell them it's not. I think that the role, especially in my role, where it's a little different because I'm a consultant, it's a little harder for in-house people to have that conversation with the CEO. But as a consultant, they're paying me to provide third-party kind of subjective advice and view. And so I have had some of those conversations where a CEO is like, oh, we're definitely this. And I'm like, no, like that's not how your employees feel. And so if you commit to that and you put your foot down and say, yes, this is how we're going to talk about, it's not going to feel genuine in the employees. They're not going to adopt it. They're not going to embrace it. And they're going to feel it's a little disingenuous. So I think it's okay to own some of your warts as an organization and realize that, like, we're building towards X. We're not X yet, but this is what we aspire to be. And talk about that openly rather than saying, yes, we're X, because your employees are like, you're not X. And that's gonna end up creating more of a disengagement wedge with employees that I think if you just own, like, hey, we this is what we are. We know that we're not there yet, but this is where we want to be, and we want to involve you in that process. And I think companies have to have an open mind to being open and transparent around who they really are, even if it's not yet where they want to be.
Yeah. Well, so you brought up an interesting point. Like, as a consultant, people pay for advice. They don't have to take it. And I was listening, actually, William Tincup said that in his podcast with Jennifer McClure, which, by the way, everybody, I really recommend. I listened to that last night and it was so good. Just really good, compelling information. And Tincup's the kind of guy that you always feel like you have a whiskey in your hand when you talk to him.
His podcasts are hers because she has her own.
It's hers.
No, he was on hers, and he's brilliant. And her podcast is amazing, by the way. So I definitely recommend subscribing to that. And William, like honestly, like I have an insatiable appetite for Tincup content. Like I'll read, watch, or listen to anything that he does because he's such a distinct and real voice that I'm a huge fan.
He's a storyteller, but he takes it to a level that it feels like art when you have a conversation, and I think that's really, really powerful. But I had a point for this. So as consultants, we can say, you know what, take it or leave it. I don't give, you paid me, great. But what about people like Jose or some of these, some of our guests today who work for that company and they're going up. So they're bringing an authentic voice from the perspective of I work here. What happens then? What advice would you give to somebody who's in the shoes and going up against that CEO who's like,
No, you're right. And that's the reality a lot of practitioners face, So my best advice is bring data. Bring hard data, bring hard examples, bring tangible evidence, right? Because what you don't want to do in that position as an internal person is have anybody have a perspective that this is just your opinion, right? Or that this is just kind of, anecdotally what you think should happen, because that's not going to move a CEO, especially if they're firmly rooted in their own views. So bring data, bring evidence, bring kind of hard facts to that conversation. And if you're able to do that, it's hard to argue with that. And then you can kind of say, look, I'm basing my my view and my recommendations on this. And this is kind of irrefutable. You could look at this and say, okay, I'm going to come to a different conclusion, or I don't care, but the facts will be the facts. And so wherever you can bring hard data to that discussion, that's going to help your cause.
Absolutely.
We got a question about that.
That was my next question too. So good on you, Matt.
Katrina?
Yeah. So what data are you bringing? Okay. So you're a practitioner. You have all the data and all the access. Maybe where would you start? All right. You have 3 places, 3 systems, reports to go look at. What 3 reports are you going to look at first?
Well, I think it depends on like, what are you trying to influence? I guess that's the first question is like, what, because the data you bring is going to widely vary based on the message you're trying to reinforce. So like, what would be the message? Like, are you saying the case of a disconnect between the CEO's view of the company and the actual view?
So yeah, let's use that as the first example.
Yeah. So I would say employee survey data for one, because that's hard data, hopefully that you have and that is known. So that would certainly be one. I think Glassdoor data would be something I'd bring to that meeting as well. And a lot of CEOs don't like Glassdoor, but candidates do. So that's the reality. And whether you like what's being said or not, it's what's being said and it's what job seekers are reading. So bringing that data. And then another thing, particularly when you're talking to the CEO, that can be compelling, I think, especially if you're looking to get more investment and adoption of employer brand, is like have some data around what your competitors are doing.
Yes.
Right. And how they're positioned, how they position on Glassdoor, what is their social engagement and following, right? Like data that you can get publicly. So you can bring and you can say, look, you might not believe in employer brand or you might not believe in what we're doing, but you know that we're competing against X, Y, and Z company. And like, look at what they're doing. Look at the engagement that they have here. So like they're talking to our candidates. They're influencing our candidates through their voice. We have no share of that because we're not involved. So don't you think that it would be worth an investment so that we can have that conversation as well? So those would be 3 things that I think would be compelling in that particular use case.
Especially if they're competitive, because they won't like that if the competitors are doing it, right?
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of CEOs react to that whole, and this is what your top 3 competitors are doing. And you see the spark go because saying like this, your company, the second you add that competitive angle, oftentimes that's a CEO character trait that's very easy to tap into.
Fear is a hell of a motivator.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. And Paul just brought up a really good point. Thank you for being here, Paul. He said, you start with emotion and storytelling. So I'd be curious from your perspective, and I actually just read one of your posts about this week about storytelling and job descriptions, right?
Yeah.
How do you bring storytelling to EVP activation? I know it depends, but what are your favorites?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I generally like to do is like you have the way, and again, I'm not saying this is the right approach. This is just my own approach is like, I'll generally take an EVP and I will identify and kind of distill it to 3 EVP pillars. 3 is the right number to me. That these are kind of the key things that are represented in the EVP and should be represented in the employee experience and should be kind of the the through line, if you will, for anything you do in employer brand. It'll tie back to one of these 3 things. And then once you have those 3 things, then you can activate stories based on that. So it's almost like you're kind of mapping it out, right? So you have the EVP here, you have the pillars here, and then aligned to each pillars, you have the types of stories that will illuminate that pillar, and then the actual campaigns. So that's like whether it's a blog, whether it's something on Facebook Live, whether it's a hashtag, whatever that can bring that to life. So I kind of look at it as a cascading structure for how the EVP informs the pillars, which informs the content, which informs the strategies on how you take it to market. And then I think the stories are the best way to bring that to life, right? And so, we've been doing this long enough where, you kind of know, like employee generated content is the holy grail of employer brand content because it's authentic and it's real. And if you create an environment that empowers employees to kind of share their true experience, and you can guide it in the sense of saying like, hey, we're trying to tell stories about X. If you have stories you want to share about X, that would be great. So there's a little bit of prompting, so it does tie back to those pillars. And then you kind of let them share their story and share their truth. And so one of the interesting things when I was 3 years ago, I think it was, I was working with Hootsuite on kind of an initial engagement. Actually, I was working with Ambrosia there, and we piloted a kind of platform on SoundCloud called the Hootsuite Storytelling Lab. Yes. And we interviewed some employees and had them talk about different elements of their role that was tied to Hootsuite. And the one that is just profound to me is one of their head of partnerships. And this is when, Hootsuite was young. They weren't the juggernaut they are now. They got a call from HBO, and it was a show producer talking about some new show that was getting ready to come out. And it was based on a series of books, and it was a fantasy show, and they weren't really sure how it was going to be adopted, but they wanted to develop a social strategy for it because they thought that would make it more compelling. And it turned out it was Game of Thrones, and it was just this really, and it was literally just, it was probably a 90-second audio clip. And like the intimacy of audio where there's no other distractions. It's just you and a voice. And it was so deeply meaningful to me. Like I heard that and I'm just like, I've listened to it probably 100 times because it was just so profound. And like, that was, again, it's 90 seconds. It was a brief story, but it was this real kind of story of the kind of work that gets done there and the kind of experiences you may have there. And there was something just really kind of rich and real and raw, about that I found really compelling. So to me, those are the stories that I think really resonate. It doesn't matter what platform they're on, but it's just an intimate inside kind of baseball view of an experience in an employee's perspective and in their own voice.
Yeah. I think one of the best examples on the market, not necessarily for recruiting, is StoryCorps. I love those stories. I would be driving. So they're on NPR and they're basically, a couple minutes of basically two people sitting down with a mic and having a conversation about a topic or an experience they had in their life or their relationship. They have entire series now about love, and they have books and all these storytelling. But I feel like they have taken storytelling to a whole new level.
Oh yeah, they're the gold standard, I think, right now. And the cool thing about it is like they kind of created this framework that average people participate. They're not journalists. They're not they're not professional writers or bloggers. So there's just this deep kind of realness to the conversations. And I mean, I've had, like obviously I used to work at NPR, so I've had, NPR driveway moments we kind of talk about where like you can't get out of your car because you're so engrossed in the story. And vast majority of those that I've had have been StoryCorps, interviews where I'm just like, I need to hear this. And I mean, some you'll get emotional. Like I've sat in a car crying because of a story. Because I'm just like, it touched me in a deep way. And I'm like, I don't know this person. Like, I don't know their plight, but like, it's just, the connection was so real that, that's powerful.
Yeah, I've definitely had those moments. I remember when I lived in Boston driving on my commute to care.com, which was my last actual commute many years ago, listening every Friday morning, they would come on en route. And I even know like what part of the road where that would come on in the mornings, and because it was that powerful. And I think that actually gets to Steve's question about getting employees to generate content. So they have their own model where they drive a bus around the country and show up at the door and create a safe place to share those stories. How do you how do you create the bus model for your employees?
Yeah, it's hard. And I think that this is, we talk a lot about brand ambassadors and, brand evangelists, whatever term you want to use. Like, I think that a lot of companies where they get that wrong is that it's driven by HR. So they're like, we got to do hashtag, like use this hashtag. Hey, chaka, like we're hip and cool. So like that, like you're not going to be received that way. Like people want to do what their peers are doing, and they don't want to feel like it's forced. But another piece is like, I do think brand ambassador programs, like proactive brand ambassador programs, are important and are meaningful. But what I think is also important and kind of key to their success is you got to do what's in it for me. Like, it's not just like, we want you to share this because, so what I recommend is if you're developing a program, create a framework for it that actually has a very clear value prop to employees and is real. So you're saying, hey, look, we want you to be active on social. We want you to share your stories. We want you to use our hashtag, and we want to show off the caliber of people that we have. And we think that's going to help us be able to recruit more effectively. But if you do that, here's what we're going to do for you. Like, ultimately, our aim is to have you build an incredible personal brand. And we want to give you the tools to do that. And that's going to help you here. That's going to help you wherever you go next. And so we're going to help you with, how to write a compelling LinkedIn profile, how to take and edit photos or videos on a smartphone, how to do public speaking, right?
Yes.
Like we're going to actually have courses and like clear kind of, giveaways, educational pieces, whatever, for people in the brand ambassador program. So they get a clear, like, we're giving you this. We want this. We want you to do this. This is behavior that we'd like to incentivize, but we're not saying just do it to do it. We're saying, we're going to help you do it. And our aim is to actually help you have an amazing personal brand. And you're going to take that with you beyond, your time working with us here. And that's cool. Like we get that. But so I think it's a give to get, right? And it's not like gamification. It's not, you said 10 tweets and we'll put you in a raffle to win a free day off coupon. Like, no. Yeah. Like that's, no, don't do that. Like because that's just not, like, that's going to kill your credibility. And like, just don't do that.
The other thing I heard,
go ahead.
That was smart, is to not start with the whole company and be like, everyone do this.
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just few pockets of people that are kind of maybe doing it already and kind of honing that in. Because some people, especially in cybersecurity, we have a lot of employees that are like, I don't want to be on social media, and that's fine. So maybe they're not going to be the ones on social. We can figure out a different way, but not.
Yeah, you can't force it. And what I generally recommend, I mean, and you're probably familiar with the story, like the whole like NPR Life, which I think was the first kind of culture hashtag that was created. And that's still in pilot mode. Like that never was formally launched. Like initially I wanted to do like a big wide push, and comms told me to blank myself. And so I said, all right, well, let me pilot it with a small group. And I knew a few journalists, I had a few friends, and I kind of had this employer brand steering committee of people that I would socialize ideas to, because journalists are, skeptical and they'll tell you how it is. And I'm like, hey, I've got this great idea. And they'd be like, no, that's a horrible idea. No one's going to do that. I'm like, thank you. So we created it. And, basically people just saw their peers using the hashtag. And we never launched it. We never said anything about it other than I had 5 people who I said, hey, would you consider using this and they did. And then people saw them do it, and then they did it, and then they did it. And, now there's over 10,000 posts on Instagram and, 30,000 or more tweets from using the hashtag. But like, that's, again, like, it's not, if people feel that it's a mandate from HR or recruiting, or it's something that's forced and pushed, like there's just, whether it's conscious or not, there's a natural kind of defense that goes up when you do that. So if you find influencers in your organization, engage them and let them kind of lead the way. And if you do that, your adoption is going to be much higher.
Genius.
Totally. And I shared a link as well from Dell, who's actually doing this right now. So and this is really high level. I just read the article yesterday, which is why it was top of mind for me. But so they basically built a program that teaches their employees how to build their brand, which inherently has kind of created a pipeline for that employee generated content, or at least that's my perspective, right? They basically taught them exactly how to do it the way they would want them to do it. And then we're like, okay, use it for yourself or for us. I love that. I mean,
GE did the same thing. So, Shonda had contributed a case study to HR Open Source on GE's program that is exactly that. And includes actually their deck. So like the actual deck they use to train their employees. So you can, if you're watching, you can go to HR Open Source and pull the GE case study and download that for free.
Yeah.
It's really useful. I took some pieces for that for our program for sure. That was great.
Yeah, me too. Sharing is caring, right?
Stolen.
Yeah. No. That's the beauty of it, right? Like there are like, it's funny. They I don't know if you've ever read the book Steal Like an Artist by Austin. And like this idea, like nobody is original. There are no original. Like everything was inspired in some way by something else, and so like that's the cool thing about not just HR Open Source, but like other initiatives, like this idea of kind of openness and collaboration is like, it's okay. Like always credit. So if you're going to like Shonda, thank you for contributing that. Like we're all using pieces of that and that came from you. So thank you. So credit, but there's nothing wrong with kind of taking something that somebody's done and kind of tweaking it, localizing it and repurposing it, especially with this idea of open source. It's like, that's the whole idea, is that you don't have to build this thing from scratch every time. If somebody's already done it, take what they did, modify it, localize it, and then use it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Steve, I'm going to be honest. I don't quite understand the question, but I'm going to ask Lars, and maybe Lars will understand the question. Do you interview candidates for social value? I don't know how to define social value. And that's where I was like,
maybe like whether they are very social and use Twitter and LinkedIn.
That's what I'm guessing. Like, would they be, Paul's definitely right. Everything is a remix. No, I mean, if it would be, okay, so as a recruiter, what does a candidate bring as an ambassador? No, I don't think so. I think that social value is a plus. It's a bonus, but it's not, it doesn't impact their ability to perform successfully in the job. So I think you have to hire around that. If you get social value with it, that's great. But I don't think you can use that as a criteria unless it's like a PR person or like a marketing, unless the nature of the role, has an element of needing that. So in that case, yes, but otherwise I'd say no.
Yeah.
So about rewards. I've heard about money, which is not very common, I don't think, but I've also heard about like gift certificates. Or do you think?
Yeah, I don't. I think it artificially incentivizes behavior, and like you may get tweets, you may get likes, but you're not going to get engagement. And the content that they're creating is probably not going to be like that high. Like I know that there's lots of platforms out there that allow you to like push out content to your employees and have them amplify it and that's fine. That's no knock on that. And that's them basically, but all that is amplification. Like, right. So maybe you'll have more visibility and there's value in that. But I think to have kind of incentives, whether monetary, whether, day off coupons and stuff like that, like I just don't personally, I don't believe that, because I think that there's an artifice in that incentivization that doesn't really, allow for kind of real engaged. Like I'd much rather have a smaller number of employees highly engaged on their own than a large number of employees that are just clicking tweet and, stuff is getting, you have more stuff out there, but people don't need stuff. People are bombarded with stuff. People are overwhelmed with stuff right now. So that stuff doesn't matter. Like realness, interesting, something engaging, a story, like that matters. Like that I'll read, that I'll pay attention to. If I see 50 people tweeting the verbatim same tweet with a link, I know exactly where that came from. So, yeah.
Oh, totally. And from a metrics perspective too, as somebody who's done a lot of social media work, I don't like peaks and valleys. I want to see growth over time. Growth over time means that you're actually creating impact. Peaks and valleys, they say nothing. To me, they say, oh, you spent a little bit of money and then you stopped spending money.
Yeah. I mean, Paul raised a great point here. Like reward learning how to help socialize, but not the ongoing contribution, right? Like you want to give people the tools to be able to make the choice themselves of how they'll contribute and where they'll contribute, but you don't want to force it. Because nobody, I mean, do you want to be forced to do anything? Like nobody wants to. Even if you have a perception you're being forced, a lot of people will naturally push back and put up walls and rebel. So don't do that, because that's not going to ultimately incentivize the long-term behavior that I think you're looking for.
Exactly. There's no easier way to make me not tweet than when you send me some platform where I have to enter all of my information so you can send me tweets to tweet. Like instantly, I'm like, no. That will not be happening.
Send us your login and let us activate your feed. Like, no, I'm not going to do that.
Nope, not a chance.
I have an honest question about EVPs. That's something that I struggle with. Is so you want yours through 3 pillars, but if you're global and there's so many different cultures, and I have heard that you could still have 3 pillars, but I feel like it can be challenging. If maybe your double it off is totally different than your R&D and your sales, and they're all different.
Yeah, so I think that the way I look at those scenarios is you have the EVP and you have the pillars that should hold universal weight, right? So no matter where you work, no matter what function, no matter what country, no matter what level, there should be truth in that to you. Now there's also going to be and so kind of look at that as like the umbrella brand, if you will. Then below that, you're going to have individual value propositions. I don't mean IVPs in the sense of kind of how Bill Boorman talks about it, where it's like a value prop down to a sole person. I mean, like at a country level, or at a functional level, or at a seniority level, right? So that's going to be the way you tell those stories, while it connects to the umbrella brand, is going to be different than the way that you tell the umbrella brand story. So I think you have to allow for localization based on a lot of different factors, right? So if you just have, it's this whole idea of personalization, right? So if you just have your EVP and you're telling all of your stories based on a core EVP, that assumes that everybody in every country and every role and every function fits exactly that. And they might fit parts of that, but not that collectively. And so I think that you have to, in your case, you have to develop a localized value prop for Dublin, right? And like, what about the Dublin office is going to appeal to talent you're trying to hire in Dublin? And there should be threads of that connect to the core EVP, but the stories themselves, the strategy, the execution will be Dublin specific, as opposed to having this kind of master brand set up. And another good example of that, I guess we'll go back to HROS because why not? Dell had a case study of how they localized their content. Like Dell, Jennifer Newbill and her team do great work there. And they did a case study on how they localize content for different regions. And so I think this one focused on their Latin American market and how they basically activated brand ambassadors and localized the content so they could tell South America specific and Latin America specific stories and content to that audience that differed from the kind of global master brand.
Yeah.
I heard of it, but I haven't read it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Jennifer also, she really thinks about localizing both the language, but also her activation. So it's really specific. It's not, it's not saying that we're going to do a blog post in these 3 countries about this topic. It's in this country, they use WhatsApp. So we're going to do a WhatsApp campaign that communicates the same message that we use Facebook to communicate in this country and this to this. And it's breaking down localized activation as well, going that deep, not only in the brand, but the how. Yeah.
Yeah. It's important. Because otherwise, I think, especially if you're global, if you've got non-US markets, because global, the majority of global companies will be headquartered, or at least have their employer brand efforts headquartered out of North America, most times, not always, but often. And that's a big mistake. And that happened a lot in the early days of employer brand, where it would be like somebody in California, or New York or whatever, be like, hey, like we're going to do, look at all this cool stuff we're doing for the 4th of July. Right? And meanwhile, your employees in the UK are like, huh.
Exactly.
That's not something we have fun with, And so I think that there's almost like a global kind of tone deafness to employer brand 1.0, where we just weren't thinking about that. Now we're much more, I think, sophisticated and kind of attuned to local nuance and local activation. And Jennifer's a master of that. So
totally. And I've been talking to a few people who have US teams that are trying to figure out that international activation. And so my advice, you have to hire someone. If you really want great localized content, there is no way some kid sitting in the US who's lived there their entire life is going to write a great activation strategy for India, right? So what would your advice be for that kind of the one guy who's trying to figure out this global activation?
Yeah, I think find somebody in that local market who you can lean on. So, best case is you hire somebody, right? That's not always going to be realistic. So if you can't hire somebody, find somebody. Maybe they're an intern, maybe they're a recent grad. Like I think that actually this is the playbook that Dell had. Like they didn't hire somebody in, I think it was Brazil they were working, but they had some recent grads or interns that got involved and they activated them. So like leverage the resources you have, but you can't be hyper local from 7,000 miles away with somebody who's never stepped foot in that country. Like you can't. You can do stuff, you can be present, but you can't be local unless you have somebody kind of who is at least familiar with the region and the country and the habits and the customs, but better is there. And they don't have to be a recruiter. They don't have to be an employer brand person. They could be another employee who you can leverage and activate and say nice things about to try to get them to help you. But I always try to get a local presence to be able to at least support in some way.
Like, if you need to talk about engineering in Dublin, what better than to grab one of your Dublin engineers and say, can you write a blog? It's so simple. Like, if I try to write it, it's going to be a horrible mess. But I like that you said it doesn't have to be HR recruiting. Let's talk to all our employees.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's some person with incredible video skills in your company, or, you know, they have an incredible social media presence for something that they're really passionate about outside of your company. Like, they exist. They do exist if you look hard enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So I want to give you, we only have a few more minutes left, but I do want to give you one more chance to plug that survey and pop that link over there. Oh, yeah.
Hey,
okay, this is a Lars plug. Go for it.
Okay, actually, I'm done. You guys took care of that. Thank you. No, the only thing that I want to plug is the HR open source survey. Like, I think we're again, our aim is to kind of benchmark real practitioners' views towards the future of work. And so we want to get as much data as possible to help us do that. And so the survey will be open through next Friday, April 6th. You can get it at hros.co/survey, all lowercase. And it's about 10 minutes to fill out. It is, admittedly, it's pretty detailed, and that's by design because we really wanted to get some good, deep data on kind of the minds of practitioners in terms of their current roles and technologies they use now, and kind of what they think that will look like 3 years from now, which is our horizon for the future of work. And so once the results are in, we're going to analyze them with our analyst in residence, George LaRock, and then we're going to publish a report with our findings, but we're also going to create a dynamic data visualization microsite with all the data to allow anybody to come, look at it, toggle it, manipulate it in different ways to source different stories and learnings, and make that available all free, of course, for no cost. So yeah, hros.co/survey, take it, share it, tell your friends, tell your coworkers, write it on a Post-it note and put it on people's monitors. If you want to be that person, whatever it takes. And again, most importantly, like all the data, it's nonpartisan, it's not vendor driven. That we're gonna open up all the data once it's done, and allow everybody to kind of see that and actually get some tangible ideas. And Katrina, to your point, like, it's going to be really valuable for practitioners looking to get investment on things. It's going to be really valuable for HR tech, the HR tech world, kind of understanding what people are thinking about, what their tools they're using now, what tools they're thinking about buying. And then from an analyst and blogger and speaker and pundit standpoint, it's going to be a treasure trove of data to really give you some hard views on what practitioners are really thinking about. So we're really excited. This is like our first, next to the case studies and Sparks, like our first big signature piece of content. We've been talking about doing this since we created HROS, since we were piloting this at Hootsuite way back in the day when it was Hoot HROS. We were talking about, like, wouldn't it be cool if we could build this engaged global community of innovators in HR recruiting and then get their perspectives on what they're working on and what they're thinking about.
Nice.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
How long will it take for the results after the 6th?
We plan to publish in May at some point. So probably about a month to kind of really dig into all the data, and then also build the site. So that's going to create some customization. We're likely going to be using Tableau Public for that, but we're still exploring a couple different tools. And so we'll have the data, and so there'll be kind of two elements. One will be digesting and crunching and analyzing, and then writing up our findings. And then the other piece is going to be building the microsite. So we want those pieces to both be right. So likely it'll be sometime in May.
Awesome. Look forward to it. So no show next week. We have next one will be April 13th. This year's flying by. But thank you so much, Lars, and thank you, Katrina, for all 3 shows. It's been fantastic.
Of course.
And everyone at Lars Twitter, right?
Yep, that's me. And thanks so much. This has been a lot of fun. So I appreciate having me on.
Awesome. Thank you both.
Bye, guys. Have a great weekend.
Right. See everyone. Enjoy the weekend.